The rope cut into Cordelia Whitmore's wrists as she struggled against the wooden post. Her emerald dress torn and mud-stained from her desperate flight through the Kentucky hills. "Kincaid," she screamed into the darkness, her voice echoing off the abandoned mill's stone walls. Kincaid Harper. 3 hours earlier, she'd been dancing at the Harvest Festival. Now she was bait in a trap designed to destroy the only man she'd ever loved. "Shut your mouth, girl," snarled Tobias Grimm, the outlaw leader whose scarred face spoke of violence and cruelty. "Your precious sheriff will come running soon enough, and when he does, we'll be ready." He gestured to his 5 men positioned around the mill, their rifles gleaming in the moonlight. "Been planning this for months, ever since Harper put my brother in the ground." Cordelia's heart hammered against her ribs, but not from fear for herself. Kincaid Harper was the finest sheriff Millbrook County had ever seen, but he was also stubborn, honorable, and completely willing to die for anyone under his protection. When he heard her scream Zand, she knew he would, 'cause he always seemed to know when she was in trouble, he'd come charging in without backup, without a plan, with nothing but his Colt .45 and his misguided sense of duty. "You're making a mistake," she said, forcing steel into her voice despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Sheriff Harper isn't some lovesick fool who will throw away his life." Grimm's laugh was like gravel scraping glass, isn't he? Word around these parts, as he's been sweet on the judge's daughter for nigh on 2 years. Too honorable to court you proper while that fancy Boston lawyer's been sniffing around, but sweet on you all the same. The truth in his words cut deeper than the ropes. Kincaid had never spoken of his feelings, never overstepped the boundaries of propriety, but she'd seen it in his eyes during church services, felt it in the way his voice softened when he spoke her name, just as he'd never known that she'd turned down Reginald Thornfield's marriage proposal 3 times because her heart belonged to a Kentucky sheriff who thought himself beneath her station. A horse's hoofbeats thundered across the valley, growing closer with each passing second. Cordelia's stomach dropped. He was coming, just as Grimm had predicted, and she was about to watch the man she loved ride straight into an ambush. "There's your knight in shining armor," Grimm whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "Right on schedule, Cordelia." "What? Kincaid's?" Voice boomed across the night, rough with desperation and fury. "If you've hurt her, Grimm, you'll what, Sheriff?" Grimm called back, stepping into the doorway where Kincaid could see him. "Come in here and face me like a man? Walk into my trap like the fool you are?" The hoofbeats stopped just outside the mill. Cordelia could picture Kincaid dismounting, his tall frame moving with the careful precision that made him deadly in a gunfight. His black hair would be disheveled from the hard ride, his gray eyes calculating the odds, searching for another way in. "Let her go, Grimm." Kincaid's voice was closer now, though she couldn't see him yet. "Your quarrel's with me, not her." "My quarrel's with any man who'd gun down my blood in the street," Grimm replied.
But you're right about one thing, she's just the bait. Come on in, Sheriff. Come collect your lady love." Delia closed her
eyes, knowing that in the next few minutes, either Kincaid would die trying to save her, or she'd watch him kill 6 men and carry that weight for the rest of his life. Neither outcome was acceptable, which meant she'd have to find a third option, even if it killed her. Kincaid Harper crouched behind a fallen log 50 yards from the mill, the sheriff's badge catching the moonlight as he studied the building with the practiced eye of a man who'd survived 12 gunfights and countless dangerous situations. 6 men positioned at windows and corners, all armed with rifles, Cordelia tied up in the center like a sacrificial lamb. The smart thing would be to ride back to town, gather a posse, and return with overwhelming force. The problem was that Cordelia didn't have that kind of time. His heart couldn't bear the thought of her suffering one more second of fear. He'd been a fool to think he could keep his feelings hidden. Hell, half the county knew he was head over heels for Judge Whitmore's daughter, including apparently every outlaw between here and Tennessee. What they didn't know was that she'd already rejected 3 marriage proposals from men far more suitable than a rough-edged sheriff, whose only inheritance was a Colt .45 and a talent for violence. "I can see you thinking out there, Harper." Voice carried across the clearing. "But there ain't no clever way out of this. You come in alone, or I start cutting pieces off your pretty little girlfriend." Kincaid's jaw tightened. Through the window, he could see Cordelia's defiant posture, the way she held her head high, even with her hands bound. She was the strongest woman he'd ever known, born to silk and privilege but with a spine of pure steel. Which was exactly why she'd never accept the rough affections of a man who'd killed more people than he could count. "Kincaid Harper, you stubborn fool." Cordelia's voice suddenly rang out, clear and strong. "Ash, don't you dare come in here. I'd rather die than watch you. Throw your life away." The words hit him like a physical blow. She was willing to die to keep him safe. The realization shattered something inside his chest, replacing calculation with pure, desperate love. "Shut her up," Grimm snarled to one of his men. "Don't you touch her," Kincaid roared, abandoning his cover and charging toward the mill. Colt was in his hand, though he didn't remember drawing it, and rage had replaced tactical thinking. "He's our boy," Grimm said with satisfaction. "Just like his daddy's old heart and no brains." But Kincaid had learned something in 12 years of wearing. A badge. Sometimes the direct approach was exactly what your enemies didn't expect. Instead of bursting through the front door like they anticipated, he dove and rolled, coming up against the mill's stone wall, just as 6 rifles opened fire where he should have been. "Where is he?" one of the outlaws shouted. "Find him," Grimm bellowed. Kincaid was already moving, using the mill's architecture and the darkness to his advantage. These men were used to open gunfights and barroom brawls, not tactical warfare against someone who'd studied every building in his county for exactly this kind of situation. A shadow moved past a window. Kincaid's Colt spoke once. The shadow dropped. 5 left. "He's picking us off," someone yelled. "Stay calm," Grimm ordered. But Kincaid could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "He's just one man." "One man who knows this country better than you do," Kincaid called. Out, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "One man who's been waiting 2 years for an excuse to put you in the ground." Another outlaw moved carelessly past a doorway, and Kincaid's second shot dropped him. For left, plus Grimm. Inside the mill, Cordelia had been working at her bonds with desperate efficiency. Years of needlework had given her nimble fingers. The outlaws had been more concerned with speed than security when they'd tied her up. The rope was beginning to give way. "Cordelia." Kincaid's voice was closer now. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she called back, then whispered urgently. Grimm's behind the big support beam with a rifle trained on the door. "I heard that," Grimm snarled, striking her across the face hard enough to snap her head sideways. The sound of the blow carried across the mill. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any gunshot.
When Kincaid spoke again,
The voice was utterly without emotion, the voice of a man who'd moved beyond anger into something far more dangerous. "You just made your last mistake, Tobias Grimm." The mill fell silent except for the distant sound of water trickling over the old wheel. Cordelia's cheek throbbed where Grimm had struck her, but she forced herself to keep working at the ropes. She could feel them loosening, strand by strand. "Harper," Grimm called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I've got a knife to your girl's throat. Show yourself or I'll open her up like a Christmas turkey." Cordelia felt the cold steel press against her neck, but instead of fear, she felt only determination. The rope around her left wrist finally gave way, though she kept her hands positioned as if still bound. If she could free her right hand and create a distraction— "You won't kill her." Kincaid's voice came from somewhere near the mill wheel, calm and certain. "She's the only thing keeping you alive right now. Is that so?" Grimm pressed the knife harder, drawing a thin line of blood. Cordelia bit back a gasp. "That's so," Kincaid replied. "Because the moment she dies, I stop playing this game by civilized rules and start playing it by mine." 3 of Grimm's remaining. Men exchanged nervous glances. They'd heard stories about Sheriff Harper's war record. It's about what he'd done in places like Shiloh and Gettysburg before he'd pinned on a badge and tried to become a civilized man. "You're bluffing," Grimm said, but uncertainty colored his words. "Am I?" Kincaid's voice was closer now. "Ask the Morton brothers." "Oh wait, you can't. They're both in the ground because they thought I was bluffing too." A board creaked somewhere in the darkness above them. The outlaws spun toward the sound. Rifles raised, but saw only shadows and moonbeams filtering through broken windows. "He's in the loft," one of them whispered. Then flush him out, Grim ordered. As two of the men started toward the ladder leading to the upper level, Cordelia made her move. Her right hand slipped free of the loosened rope, and she drove her elbow back into Grim's ribs with all the force she could muster. The outlaw leader grunted and stumbled backward, the knife clattering across the stone floor. "Now, Kincaid," she screamed. The mill exploded into chaos. Kincaid dropped from the shadows like an avenging angel, his Colt speaking twice in rapid succession. Two outlaws fell before they could bring their rifles to bear. The third spun toward Cordelia, but she was already rolling away from the post, her years of horseback riding giving her the agility to avoid his clumsy grab. Grim lunged for his fallen knife, but Kincaid was already there, his boot coming down hard on the outlaw's wrist. Bone cracked, and Grim screamed. "That's for touching her," Kincaid said coldly. The last standing outlaw raised his rifle, but Cordelia snatched up a piece of broken pottery and hurled it at his head. The distraction was all Kincaid needed. His fourth shot took the man's center mass, dropping him beside his companions. Suddenly, Mill was silent, except for Grim's whimpering and the sound of Cordelia's labored breathing. Kincaid kicked the outlaw's weapons away, then turned to where Cordelia was struggling to her feet. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion as he saw the blood on her throat. "It's just a scratch," she said, though her legs were shaking with reaction. "Kincaid, I don't," he interrupted, holstering his Colt. "Don't say anything you might regret when the shock wears off." But Cordelia stepped closer instead of away, her green eyes blazing with something that had nothing to do with fear or gratitude, regret. "The only thing I regret is waiting so long to say what should have been said years ago." Kincaid went very still. "Cordelia, ... double quotes, I love you," she said simply. "I've loved you since the day you pulled me out of Miller's Creek. When I was 16 and too stubborn to admit I couldn't swim as well as I thought. I've loved you through every Sunday service where you sat 3 pews behind me, through every town dance where you were too much of a gentleman to ask me to waltz, through every moment you thought yourself beneath my notice. You're Judge Whitmore's daughter," he said quietly. "You could marry anyone I could," she agreed. "But I only want to marry you." Grim chose that moment to make one last desperate play, reaching for a hidden derringer with his good hand. But Cordelia saw the movement in her peripheral vision and stepped protectively in front of Kincaid without thinking. "No!" Kincaid roared, pushing her aside and drawing faster than thought itself. His fifth shot ended Tobias Grim permanently. The echoes of the final gunshot faded into silence, leaving Kincaid and Cordelia alone among the bodies scattered across the mill floor. Dawn was beginning to creep through the broken windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that seemed obscene after so much violence. "You could have been killed," Kincaid said harshly, his hands shaking as he checked her for injuries. "What in God's name were you thinking, stepping in front of me like that?" "The same thing you were thinking when you came charging in here alone," Cordelia replied, wincing as his fingers found the cut on her throat. "That some things are worth dying for. It's different." "How?" She caught his face between her palms, forcing him to meet her eyes. "How is it different, Kincaid Harper? Because you're a man and I'm a woman? Because you wear a badge and I wear silk dresses? Or because you've decided I'm too good for you, and nothing I say will change your mind?" He stared down at her, this woman who just helped him kill 6 men and was looking at him like he hung the moon and stars. Her hair had come loose from its pins falling in chestnut waves around her shoulders. Her dress was ruined, her face was streaked with dirt and blood, and she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Your father will have my hide," he said finally. "My father has been dropping hints about you for 2 years," she replied with a shaky laugh. "He thinks you're the only man in 3 counties with enough backbone to handle his stubborn daughter. Cordelia, ... He trailed off, overwhelmed by the impossibility of it all. A few hours ago, he'd been convinced she was destined for someone like Reginald Thornfield, educated, refined, wealthy. Now she was standing in a mill full of corpses telling him she loved him. "I know what you're thinking," she said softly. You're thinking about all the reasons we don't make sense on paper. You're thinking about the differences in our stations, about your past, about whether a man who's killed as many people as you have deserves happiness, don't I? The question came out raw, vulnerable in a way that made her heart ache. You deserve everything good this world has to offer, she said fiercely. You're the finest man I've ever known, Kincaid Harper. You protect people who can't protect themselves. You stand between the innocent and the wolves that would devour them. You're honorable and brave and kind. And if you think for 1 second that I care more about what society expects than about what my heart wants, then you don't know me at all. Before he could respond, the sound of horses reached them from outside. A lot of horses, approaching fast. Yes, Kincaid said, his professional demeanor sliding back into place. I sent word to Deputy Morrison before I left town. They emerged from the mill to find 20 armed men surrounding the building. Led by Deputy Ben Morrison, and to Cordelia's surprise, her father, Judge Whitmore. The judge's silver hair was disheveled, his usually immaculate clothes hastily thrown on, and his face was carved with worry and rage. Cordelia. He dismounted and gathered her into his arms, his hands trembling as he assured himself she was unharmed. When Morrison told me you'd been taken, I thought, ... Are you hurt? Did they? I'm fine, Papa, she said, though she was beginning to feel the reaction setting in. Sheriff Harper saved me. Judge Whitmore looked over her head at Kincaid, who was already briefing Deputy Morrison on the situation inside the mill. 6 men. 6, Kincaid confirmed. The grim gang won't be troubling anyone else. Single-handed, Morrison said with something approaching. Ah, how in hell language. Deputy, Judge Whitmore said mildly, though his attention remained fixed. On Kincaid, Sheriff Harper. I believe you and I need to have a conversation. Ah! Cordelia felt her stomach drop. This was at the moment her father would forbid any relationship between them, would remind Kincaid of the vast gulf between their social positions. Yes, sir, Kincaid said, his face carefully blank. I reckon we do.
Ah, good.
But first, let's get my daughter home and cleaned up. She's been through enough for one night. Judge Whitmore helped Cordelia onto his horse, then mounted behind her. Sheriff, you'll join us for breakfast. We have much to discuss, as they rode back to Wardtown. Cordelia leaning against her father's familiar warmth, she caught Kincaid's eye. He looked like a man riding toward his execution, convinced that her father was about to end whatever chance they might have had. If only he knew that.
Out.
Judge Whitmore had been hoping for exactly this development for the better part of 2 years. The Whitmore mansion sat on the hill overlooking Millbrook like a beacon of civilization. Its white columns and manicured gardens, a stark contrast to the violence of the mill. Cordelia had bathed and changed into a simple blue morning dress, the cut on her throat hidden beneath a high collar. Her hands had finally stopped shaking, but her heart was still racing not from fear, but from anticipation and dread in equal measure. Downstairs in the study, she could hear the low murmur of male voices. Her father and Kincaid had been talking for over an hour while she'd cleaned up, and the waiting was driving her to distraction. Miss Cordelia, their housekeeper Mrs. Henderson, appeared in the doorway with a breakfast tray. Your father asked me to bring this up, said you should eat something before you faint dead away. I'm not going to faint, Cordelia protested, though she did feel lightheaded. She hadn't eaten since the festival, and the events of the night had left her drained. Of course not, Mrs. Henderson said, with the tone of someone who'd been managing Whitmore family crises for 20 years. Strong as an ox you are, just like your dear departed mother. She set the tray down and gave Cordelia a long look. That sheriff of ours is a good man. He's not ours, Cordelia said automatically, though her heart skipped at the words. Isn't he? Could have fooled me watching him charge off into the night like some knight-errant when he heard you'd been taken. Mrs. Henderson smoothed her apron. With satisfaction, a man doesn't risk his life for a woman unless she means something considerable to him. Before Cordelia could respond, footsteps on the stairs announced the end of the mysterious conference. She heard her father's voice in the hallway. Think about what we've discussed, Sheriff. Think hard. Then Kincaid's deeper tones. I will, sir. Thank you for ... for everything. The front door opened and closed, and Cordelia flew to her window to watch Kincaid mount his bay gelding. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders. The way he sat in the saddle like a man carrying the weight of the world. "Cordelia." Her father's voice came from the doorway. "May I come in?" She turned to face him, trying to read his expression. Judge Whitmore was a master at hiding his thoughts, but she thought she detected a glimmer of something amusement. Satisfaction? In his blue eyes? "What did you say to him?" she asked without preamble. "I offered him a job," her father said, settling into the chair by her fireplace. "District attorney for the county. Comes with a substantial salary increase and considerable social standing." Cordelia's heart sank, and he turned it down. "He did." Judge Whitmore smiled. "Said he wasn't interested in advancing himself through his connection to my daughter. Said if he was going to court you, it would be as himself a sheriff who's earned his own way in the world." "Court me?" The words came out as barely a whisper. "Oh yes. That man is thoroughly besotted with you, my dear, has been for years, from what I can tell. The only thing stopping him has been his certainty that I'd never approve of the match." Cordelia sank onto her bed, overwhelmed. "And do you approve, I mean?" Her father was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Your mother was the daughter of a wealthy plantation owner. I was a circuit judge's son, with more ambition than money. Her father forbade the match, said I was beneath her station." He smiled softly. "We eloped 3 weeks later, and never regretted a moment of it, Papa. ... Kincaid Harper is the finest man I've ever known," Judge Whitmore continued. "He's honest, brave, and decent to his core. He'd die before he'd let harm come to you. And he'd spend his life making you happy.
Yes.
What more could a father want for his daughter? Then why did he look like he was going to his own execution when he left? Because I told him he had to do this properly? No midnight elopements or hasty ceremonies born of crisis and adrenaline? If he wants to marry my daughter, he's going to court her with all the respect and ceremony she deserves." Judge Whitmore rose and headed for the door. "I suspect he'll be calling on you this afternoon, once he's had time to work up his courage." Alone again, Cordelia moved to her window and looked out over the town. Somewhere down there, Kincaid was probably pacing, his small apartment above the jailhouse, trying to figure out how to navigate the unfamiliar waters of proper courtship. The thought made her smile despite everything. She'd waited 2 years for him to see what was right in front of his face. She supposed she could wait a few more hours for him to come calling with flowers and formal intentions, but not much longer. Her patience, like her father's before her, had its limits. Kincaid Harper stood in front of the mirror in his small apartment, adjusting his string tie for the 5th time in as many minutes. He'd bathed, shaved, and put on his best suit, the black one he usually reserved for funerals and court appearances. His hands were steadier than they'd been during the gunfight at the mill. But his heart was hammering like a blacksmith's anvil, courting. Judge Whitmore had used that word specifically, with all its implications of formal visits, chaperoned conversations, and gradual progression toward what? Marriage? The possibility seemed too enormous to contemplate. A knock at his door interrupted his nervous preparations. "Come in." Deputy Morrison entered, took one look at Kincaid's formal attire, and grinned. Well, calling on the judge's daughter, are we?" "Shut up, Ben. Never thought I'd see the day when Sheriff Kincaid Harper got tongue-tied over a woman."
Ow.
Morrison settled into the room's single chair, clearly planning to enjoy himself. "You know, half the town's been taking bets on when you'd finally work. Up the courage to court Miss Cordelia. Half the town needs to mind its own business. Come now, Kincaid. It's not like it's been a secret. You've been pining after that girl like a lovesick calf for nigh on 2 years. Even old Mrs. Patterson noticed, and she's blind as a bat." Kincaid glared at his deputy, but there was no real heat in it. Morrison had been his friend since the war, had stood beside him through gunfights and hard times. If anyone had earned the right to tease him, it was Ben. What if I mess this up? The question escaped before Kincaid could stop it, revealing more vulnerability than he'd intended. Morrison's expression sobered. "You won't. You're the most honorable man I know, Kincaid." That girl's lucky to have you interested in her. I'm a sheriff with a 6th grade education and a history of violence. She's Judge Whitmore's daughter. She's also the woman who risked her life to warn you about an ambush last night. The woman who stepped in front of a gun to protect you. Seems to me she's made her choice pretty clear. Before Kincaid could respond, the church bells began chiming 3 o'clock. Time to go. The walk to the Whitmore mansion felt like the longest of Kincaid's life. Every step brought fresh doubts, fresh awareness of the gulf between his rough background and Cordelia's refined upbringing. By the time he reached the front gate, his palms were sweating despite the cool October air. Mrs. Henderson answered his knock, her weathered face breaking into a smile. "Afternoon, Sheriff Harper. Miss Cordelia's been expecting you." He was shown into the front parlor, where afternoon sunlight streamed through lace curtains and painted everything in soft golden hues. Cordelia rose from her seat by the window, and Kincaid's breath caught in his throat. She was wearing a dress of deep green silk that brought out the color of her eyes. Her chestnut hair arranged in an elegant style that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. She looked every inch the refined lady she was, and Kincaid felt his courage faltering. "Sheriff Harper," she said formally, though he could see the warmth in her eyes. "How good of you to call, Miss Whitmore." He remained standing by the door, hat in hand, suddenly unsure of the protocols involved. "I hope you're feeling better after... after last night." "Much better, thank you." She gestured to the settee. "Please, won't you sit? Mrs. Henderson has prepared tea." The next hour passed in a blur of polite conversation and careful observance of social niceties. They discussed the weather, the upcoming harvest festival, the new school being built on the outskirts of town. It's all perfectly proper, perfectly appropriate, and absolutely maddening. Finally, when Kincaid thought he might explode from the tension, Cordelia set down her teacup and fixed him with a direct look. "Sheriff Harper, are you planning to ask my father for permission to court me, or are we going to spend the next 6 months discussing the price of grain?" The blunt question surprised a laugh out of him. "I was working up to it." "Work faster," she said with a smile that made his heart skip. "I'm not getting any younger, and neither are you." "Cordelia." He set down his own cup and leaned forward. "Are you certain about this? About us? Because once I ask your father, once we start down this path, there's no going back. I won't be able to pretend I don't love you anymore." "Good," she said simply, "because I love you too, Kincaid Harper. I love your courage, your integrity, your stubborn sense of honor. I love the way you protect people, the way you make me feel safe and cherished and alive all at once." She rose and moved to stand in front of him, close enough that he could catch the scent of her perfume. "Ask him, Kincaid. Ask my father for my hand, and let's stop wasting time on what might be and start building what will be." He stood as well, reaching out to cup her face gently in his hands. "I love you, Cordelia Whitmore. I've loved you since the day I met you, and I'll love you until the day I die." "Then ask him," she whispered. 3 months later, on a crisp January morning that sparkled with frost and possibility, Cordelia Whitmore became Cordelia Harper in front of half the county. The church was packed to overflowing. The townspeople who'd followed the romance from its violent beginning to its joyful conclusion. Kincaid stood at the altar in his best suit, freshly shaved and trying not to fidget with his string tie. "Deputy." Morrison stood beside him as best man, grinning like a fool and occasionally elbowing him in the ribs. The church doors opened, and conversation died as Cordelia appeared on her father's arm. She was radiant in ivory silk and her grandmother's lace veil, carrying a bouquet of winter roses that had been specially ordered from Louisville. But it was her smile, brilliant, joyful, aimed directly at him, that made Kincaid's knees weak with gratitude. Judge Whitmore placed Cordelia's hand in Kincaid's with obvious pride and satisfaction. "Take care of her son," he whispered. "Ow, always," Kincaid replied, his voice rough with emotion. The ceremony passed in a blur of vows and rings and the minister's droning voice. But Kincaid would remember forever the moment Cordelia looked into his eyes and promised to love, honor, and cherish him for the rest of their lives. The moment she became his wife, his partner, his heart walking around outside his body. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Phillips announced with a smile. Kincaid cupped Cordelia's face gently and kissed her with all the love and tenderness he'd been storing. Up for 2 years? The congregation erupted in applause and cheers, but he barely heard them. His entire world had narrowed to the woman in his arms and the promise of their future together. The reception was held at the Whitmore mansion, with tables groaning under Mrs. Henderson's cooking and a string quartet imported from Lexington. Kincaid found himself swept into conversations with people who'd never given him more than a polite nod before, but now welcomed him as family. "You done good, boy?" said old Tom Patterson, whose wife Kincaid had helped through her late husband's legal troubles. "That girl's lucky to have you." Similar sentiments were echoed throughout the evening, and gradually Kincaid began to relax into his new role as Cordelia's husband and a respected member of the community's social fabric. As the evening wound down, he found himself on the mansion's front porch with Judge Whitmore. Watching their guests depart into the crisp winter night. "Nervous about tonight?" the judge asked with paternal concern. Kincaid flushed. "Sir, I relax, son. It's natural. Just remember that my daughter loves you exactly as you are. Don't try to be someone else for her sake." Before Kincaid could respond, Cordelia appeared in the doorway, having changed from her wedding gown into a traveling dress of deep blue wool. Her eyes sparkled with excitement and something else that made his pulse quicken. "Ready, husband?" she asked, the word rolling off her tongue like honey. They were spending their wedding night at the hotel in town, a compromise between propriety and privacy that had been Judge Whitmore's suggestion. Tomorrow, they would move into the small house Kincaid had bought and furnished with careful attention to Cordelia's comfort. The short ride to the hotel passed in comfortable silence, Cordelia's hand warm in his as the buggy wheels crunched over the frozen ground. The hotel's best suite had been prepared for them, complete with a fire crackling in the hearth and champagne cooling in a silver bucket. "Mrs. Harper," Kincaid said wonderingly, pulling her into his arms as soon as the door closed behind them. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," she replied, her arms twining around his neck. "Though I have to admit I've been practicing writing it for weeks." He laughed and spun her around, both of them giddy with joy and relief in the intoxicating knowledge that they had the rest of their lives to love each other. Years later, when their children asked how they'd known they were meant for each other, Kincaid would tell them about a night in an old mill when their mother had risked everything to save him. Cordelia would add that she'd known the moment she heard him call her name in the darkness, not as a sheriff doing his duty, but as a man desperate to protect the woman he loved. But that night, as they held each other close and whispered promises, in the firelight they were simply Kincaid and Cordelia Harper, beginning the greatest adventure of their lives together. The sheriff and the judge's daughter, the protector and the protected, bound together by love strong enough to overcome any obstacle fate might place in their path. Outside, snow began to fall over Millbrook, blanketing the small Kentucky town. In pristine white, inside their warm sanctuary, Mr. and Mrs. Harper discovered that some stories do have fairy tale endings, especially when they're written by hearts brave enough to fight for love.